Like most long-running games, the Pokémon TCG has had a history of power creep. Power creep refers to the process of releasing new and more powerful cards that outclass the old cards. Power creep is done for three key reasons in Pokémon. 1. It forces players to buy new cards to keep up with the game. 2. Players who are newer to the game don't have to chase down the older cards that have been power crept. And 3. The designers can keep the game simple by reusing effects instead of creating more complex ones. Pokémon's power creep is also aided by one additional factor, which is the yearly rotation. Each year, the Pokémon trading card game rotates out or removes about a year's worth of sets from being able to be used in tournaments. The rotation aids in all three factors that I listed above, making sure players need to buy new cards, making sure they don't need to find old cards, and making sure that the game can remain more simple by reusing old effects. How does power creep happen in Pokémon, though? The most obvious example is the numbers on the Pokémon card going up over time. It's very easy for me to put Executor from the Jungle set next to Executor from Surging Sparks, and not only has the HP gone up significantly, but its attack is much more powerful. If Pokémon had only increased average HP and damage by 60 or so, like in the case of this Executor, power creep wouldn't really be that much of an issue. Instead, let's look at the power creep of the special cards, as I'll call them for this video, being any card that is mechanically unique. Stage 2 Charizard from the base set has 120 HP, which was the largest HP you could have at the time, since there were no special cards. We then see a special card, a Stage 2 Charizard EX from EX Fire Red and Leaf Green, have 160 HP. A couple of years later, and we see a Stage 2 Charizard GX with 250 HP. And finally, we have the modern day Stage 2 Charizard EX with 330 HP. Looking at special cards, regardless of their individual drawbacks, shows a much clearer image of where power creep is actually happening, since special cards are generally at the center of the meta and are the focus of the designers. What's even more alarming is the power creep seen on basic special cards, meaning Pokémon that can be put right onto the board. Some special cards present evolution Pokémon as basic Pokémon, meaning they don't need to take the time to evolve like usual evolution Pokémon have to. The first time we see this with Charizard is with Shining Charizard, which has 100 HP. Later, Charizard Gold Star from the EX era has 10 less HP but a much stronger attack. A few years after that, in the Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum era, we see Charizard G with 100 HP. However, it now has a Level X form, a pseudo-evolution that has 120 HP. Skip a few years forward, and now we have Charizard EX from the X and Y Flash Fire set, which has 180 HP, with a Mega Evolution that is an evolution, which has 220 HP. Fast forward to a few years after that, and now we have Reshiram and Charizard Tag Team GX with 270 HP. And finally, we get Charizard V and Charizard VMAX, which has 220 HP and evolves into a 330 HP VMAX. The power creep in the first few prints showed small increases in about 20 HP, only to then go up to 60 HP for the Flash Fire EX or 100 HP for the Mega EX. Later on, we'd see another 90 HP added for the basic Reshiram and Charizard GX, and another 60 added for Charizard VMAX. In a roughly similar time that it took for 100 HP to become 120 HP, 180 HP became 330 HP. While power creep is not always a straight line going up, Pokémon has in general had a severe problem with power creep. Power creep doesn't just happen with the numbers though, we also see this with the effects of abilities, which are the attributes of a card that a Pokémon can use in battle. You can see this for instance on an ability that is on the Stage 2 Blaziken from EX Ruby and Sapphire, and later this ability would show up on a different type on the Stage 1 Electric, which is a lot easier to get on your board earlier and in higher numbers than the Stage 2 Blaziken. Sometimes it's not always the exact same effect on a lower stage, but also the replacement of a utility with a lower stage as well. For an example, let's look at two very similar decks, the 2018 and 19's Blacephalon GX deck and 2024's Raging Bolt EX deck. Both of these decks rely on attaching a lot of energy to their board so that their attack can hit big and remove the energy from their board for big damage. Blacephalon GX relies on the Stage 1 Naganadel to attach energy to itself with its charging up ability to get its energy on board consistently to power up the attack. Raging Bolt EX uses the basic Teal Mask Ogerpon EX to get energy on its board, using its Teal Dance, which attaches an energy card from your hand to itself and then draws a card. While Teal Dance is not a strict upgrade of the charging up ability, since having to have an energy card in hand is sometimes harder to fulfill than having one in the discard pile, this card fulfills a very similar role in the deck as a basic Pokemon instead of a Stage 1 Pokemon. It even draws a card, which makes it much easier to chain this ability repeatedly despite its requirement. This allows a very similar strategy to take place, however Raging Bolt EX does not have to evolve any Pokemon, so it is usually able to attack on the very first turn of the game for a one-hit knockout. Now that you know what power creep is, why it happens, and some examples of how it happens in the Pokemon trading card game, let's cover some problems of power creep in the Pokemon TCG. Firstly, power creep simplifies the game. Power creep in Pokemon is often used as a way to make the game more approachable to new players. This happens most often at the beginning of a new generation, to ensure the transition of new players drawn in by the hype of the new games. The base stats on cards are generally increased at the beginning of a new generation, allowing for more simple effects. The complexity of the cards is then slowly ramped up again over the next few years before being reset again at the following generation, with higher stats yet again. This is an important part of the game for keeping it accessible, however a few times it has gone too far. The most egregious case of Pokemon's oversimplification was done with HeartGold and SoulSilver and the Black and White series of sets. Generation 3 and 4 of the Pokemon TCG are often cited as the golden age by longtime players due to their complexity and replayability, providing endless amounts of fun. However, during these eras, the game was much more difficult and less accessible for new players. A correction to this began in the HeartGold and SoulSilver era, where cards were simplified drastically, but since these cards still interacted with the Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum cards, the game still maintained its complexity overall. The move to the HeartGold and SoulSilver and Black and White only cards in 2011 fully transitioned into a much simpler game, with Black and White removing all of the guardrails on turn 1 play and putting the focus exclusively on big basic Pokemon that had the same or higher power levels than their evolution counterpart. Evolutions went from being the core of decks to playing supporting roles or no rules at all, starting in 2012 where only a single evolution line, played as a thin tack, made top 8 at that year's World Championships. The game had been simplified to a point where luck was a larger factor in games than it should be. 2 is speeding up the game. Part of what makes certain eras of the game appealing to players is their long and drawn out games, where a mistake can easily cost you down the line. A game of several turns may seem unfamiliar to modern day players, where games generally end in 5 or less turns, unless you're playing a deck that is purposely made to draw out games. Less turns means less chances to make mistakes, less long-term consequences for more early mistakes, and less resource management on the side of both players. Pokemon uses a few different methods of power creep to speed up the game. First is the aforementioned reuse of effects on lower stages. If the effect that I rely on is being printed on a Stage 1 or basic Pokemon instead of a Stage 2 Pokemon, I can begin executing my strategy faster and more efficiently on average, since Stage 2 Pokemon are harder to set up. Secondly is the proportional increase of damage to HP. When damages increase faster than the HP totals proportionately, KOs are achieved much faster and games are ended much quicker. For an example of this, let's look at 2 basic attackers from 3 years apart. 2017's Drampa GX and 2020's Zacian V for how damage has increased faster than HP. Drampa has 180 HP and its main attack Berserk does 80 damage but does 150 damage instead if your benched Pokemon have damage counters on them. This card was incredibly solid in the first year of Sun and Moon as a powerful basic Pokemon attacker, and with a choice band attached to a tool card, it could even take KOs on opposing basic GXs, doing 180 total damage. Now let's look at Zacian V. It comes with 220 HP, which is 40 more than Drampa GX, and its Brave Blade attack does 230 damage, which is 80 more damage than Drampa's Berserk attack. In addition, the attack does not need to fulfill a requirement like Drampa GX's does in order to do maximum damage. It also takes a KO without any kind of boost from any tool cards on opposing basic V Pokemon. While it is in theory harder to power up since it requires metal energy, this cost is achieved much easier than it should be due to its Intrepid Sword ability and its access to powerful energy acceleration via Metal Saucer item card. The damage has increased by 80, while the HP has only increased by 40 in this comparable example. Not only that, but the attack does not need any requirements for maximum damage or any boost to take KOs on an opposing basic V. Games are on average going to end quicker when attacks are taking KOs more often. Lastly, power creep can become more problematic due to the use of special cards. Reminder that special cards is a name that I'm giving to cards that are mechanically unique in some way. The first real instance of power creep with special cards was with the Ruby and Sapphire era EX cards, which gave a noticeable stat boost to regular cards, but with the downside of each of them giving up 2 prize cards when knocked out, and oftentimes having multiple weaknesses. The Diamond and Pearl era's main special cards, Level X's, did not give up an extra prize, but they were a pseudo-evolution, which required time to set up, space in your number of Pokemon you could play in a deck, and for evolution Pokemon they oftentimes came with an increased multiplier of weakness, making them easier to knock out in some instances. They did oftentimes have similar or higher stats than the Pokemon EXs, which gave up 2 prize cards, but a Level X Pokemon only giving up a single prize card when knocked out could be seen as the game slowing down. This would be changed, of course, when 2012 reintroduced Pokémon EX, this time all basic Pokémon with HP that eclipsed even fully evolved and leveled up Pokémon. They gave up 2 prize cards and led to quicker games that oftentimes had players trading one-hit KOs between big basic Pokémon. While the game didn't exactly slow down later on with the Sun and Moon era, it did try to limit how much quicker decks could get away with by printing cards that punished the faster decks that were around at the time. The GX mechanic also put evolution Pokemon back at the forefront, which did receive their own form of power creep, especially in their HP totals. The other most drastic form of using special cards for power creep happened in 2019 with the Tag Team GX Pokemon, which I covered in my other video, Pokemon's Worst Mistake, in more detail. These basic Pokemon gave up 3 prize cards and were pushed to the front of the meta. They vastly overpowered everything that came before them, including Stage 2 evolutions, vastly overpowering the Pokemon that came before them. They also forced the VMAX Pokemon cards that were printed afterward to up the ante even more, with another massive wave of power creep in an incredibly short amount of time. With short-term power creep and simplified attacks brought on by the new generation, 2020 became one of the worst times to play the game. Overall, in the Pokémon TCG, power creep is used because it forces players to buy new cards to keep up with the game, allows newer players to easily build decks since they don't need older cards, and allows designers to keep the game simpler over time. Power creep in the Pokémon TCG generally becomes a problem when it oversimplifies the game to a point where luck starts to outweigh skill, and when it speeds up the game to only last a few turns. Lastly, power creep can be a huge problem depending on how the new mechanics are introduced and balanced in the games. Thank you so much for tuning into the Whimsicast to another one of my Pokemon TCG video essays. If you enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for weekly uploads covering the history of the Pokemon TCG. Good or bad, let me know what you think of the various instances of power creep throughout the game's history. For those playing TCG Pocket, have you enjoyed the much less power crept game, or were you, like me, frustrated that the game is far too simplistic and luck-based? If you enjoyed this video, you may also enjoy my video talking about how the Tag Team Pokemon GX devastated the game with their power creep, or you may enjoy my coverage of the complex SP mechanic that ruled the 2009 and 2010 meta in my greatest sets of all time Platinum video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.